Now, Chapter 4 of The Last Boy on Earth by me, Tom Burby. Chapter 4, Mount Hope. From the Journal of Brady Smith. I've been living at La Mancha now for a while. I call it La Mancha because that's the name of Don Quixote's home, and I've been reading that book every night in a big old leather armchair next to the window that looks out onto the yard and the apple tree. This little house has everything I need. I mean, whoever lived here kept oil lamps, batteries, a gas grill in the backyard, and a lot of the comforts of home. I've looked around the place for evidence of a name to figure out who lived here, but I can't find one item in the place that's personally identifiable. Max likes it too. I'm beginning to worry, though. When I first stepped into this place, the whisperers quieted down. They left me alone, and I was truly able to sleep. But last night they found me again, like the house had a shield that kept them away, except they kept forcing themselves against it, weakening it. They're back. I may have to look for some other place. Maybe I have to give up on houses altogether. I usually start my day at the Irving gas station on top of the hill by Wilson Street. It gives me an awesome view of the city of Bangor and the Penobscot River. Also, I have plenty of access to soda, candy, chips from the store, as well as gas. At the Tractor Supply store in Bangor, I found a hand-crank siphon pump with a long plastic tube that reaches down to the ground tanks at the station. I fill the tank with gas, check the oil, and then put some food and water for both Max and me into the tub, cover it, and tie it down with bungee cords. Sometimes I hook on the trailer. Sometimes I don't. I drink a warm soda and eat a Twinkie, and then open the DeLorme map I got from inside the Irving station and begin deciding where to go today. I'm trying to figure out where my supplies are and what areas to avoid. Supplies are easy. I enter stores and businesses, empty cars, whatever. The treasure is what I'm after. Food, fuel, tools, medicine, anything that can help me survive. I have some paintball guns that I got from Walmart. I took plenty of paintballs and a ton of CO2 cartridges. Whenever I find a place that looks good, I leave it alone. If it's a bad place, for whatever reason, I shoot it with red. The doorway, the inside of the windows, whatever. It's my way of marking my territory. I also mark the DeLorme map with red and green dots to indicate where I can return and what places I ought to avoid. Take yesterday, for example. I was in Bangor driving down Main Street right by the Penobscot Theater, and I decided to go down by the waterfront. It was a nice day, and let me tell you, this is a quiet world now. I never hear much but the wind and the water. Yes, I can hear the river flowing if I listen really carefully. I stopped Rocinante, turned him off, and listened again really carefully, and Max jumped off like he does all the time, even though he usually comes back with a whistle. He wasn't gone a minute when there was a terrible commotion of sound coming from the river. I saw what it was. There was a huge murder of crows all dive-bombing Max. They were pecking at him and hounding him, and I was sure they were going to kill him. I started Rocinante and kicked him hard, and off we sped right down to the edge of the waterfront. The crows were so loud they couldn't even hear me coming. I drove right into him, blaring loud and screaming at the top of my lungs. Max was still running as fast as he could, but a few of the birds kept at him. I took the paintball guns and started shooting at both hands. I knew the paintballs wouldn't kill him, but I thought that maybe I might scare him enough to give the little guy a chance. I took aim and hit one of them right on the back. He gave out quite a caw and screamed at me. They sounded like they were talking to me or swearing at me. "Get off him!" I screamed as they started diving at me. And that's when something really weird happened. Something amazing. I wasn't going to leave Max there, so just jumping on Rocinante and riding away wasn't an option. I guessed I had to stand and fight them. I know they were only crows, but to me they seemed more than that. Somehow smarter, somehow more dangerous. They were like something out of the Lord of the Rings. Some fell creatures of Sauron, modified for evil. I was looking at maybe 20 or more of these big, black, shiny birds all moving and hovering and diving at me with a much bigger black bird coming into the picture. He came out of nowhere. He must have been twice their size, with a broader beak and a croaking voice. He dived at my attackers, and one by one he drove them off, and they respected him too. Most of them kept their distance, and after attacking the largest of the crows, the raven lowered his head near the ground and opened his wings to fill their full spread, and croaked in defiance. One by one, they took to the air and left us. He landed on top of the waterfront business building only a few feet away from me and stood there, staring down. And then he croaked loudly, tipped his head, looked me right in the eye for a long time. I think he was aware that he'd helped me. I mean, I could tell a friend when I see one, even though he might be of a different species. I took out a Slim Jim from my vest, unwrapped it, and threw it near him. He looked at it, looked away like he didn't care, and then slowly moved towards it, played with it in his beak, and picked at it. After a moment, he flew away with it in his beak. Sometimes something comes to you from somewhere deep inside. You don't even remember learning it or knowing it, but it surprises you and you wonder where the heck did that come from. And once, I read a book about the Norse gods and goddesses. It was a scary book, full of brave deeds and strong men and gods, all leading to Ragnarok and the time of the wolf, Fenris, who would devour the sun. The leader of the Viking gods was named Odin. He was a mighty, white-haired, strong man, like an old ex-wrestler. He had one eye because once, long ago, he'd hung for a whole day from his neck to suffer, and had given one of his eyes to the witch who presided over Hell, which was a cold place for Vikings. Anyway, he suffered his payment, so he would be allowed to see the end of all things, the final destination that all creation was heading towards. He saw the end of things, and left that awful place, and took his throne in the palace of Asgard, high in the sky. He was a quiet and brooding person after that, and he didn't move far from his throne. But he needed a way to see the world, to understand what was going on in the world of men and doings, and he had two ravens perched on either shoulder. They were named Hugin and Munin. Translation, thought and memory. They flew over the earth all day, and when they returned at night, they whispered in his ears, telling him what they'd seen. For the past week, I've seen Hugin more and more often. I feed him from time to time, but I think he has plenty to eat. Anyway, I began to talk to him, and he looks back at me, and he tilts his head like he can understand what I'm saying. He's never far away. Hugin led him on a wild raven chase most of the afternoon. For the past 3 hours, he and Brady and Max were all over Brewer, down by the Great River, back toward the depot, then back to the Great River again. It was as though the bird was searching for something. Brady had been surprised and then fascinated with Hugin's ability to lead him to places that he seemingly needed to go, as though he was able to anticipate Brady's needs. Today, however, seemed like the exception rather than the rule. Brady had treasure holds throughout the two cities, and he had only just begun to investigate. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of other places he would need to break into an inventory before he was done. If he was going to survive for the long term, he would need a lot of supplies. He would need to live off the detritus of the old world. He would need to be a scavenger. On his map, he had a color code and a few different color markers that he used to implement his own key. It wasn't long before he decided that the old map he'd been using was really of no use to him. There were just too many names to remember, too many places that begged to be renamed. There were empty places on the map that needed filling, and places he had no use for, necessary for the world before the abandonment. The nicely folded map had been refolded the wrong way too many times anyway, and it became clear to Brady that the world had moved in a new direction, and that this was no longer a place where the old names applied. Indeed, this was a place more like Eden, and he was Adam, naming all the animals and plants, all the buildings and roads. Street after street he made his way, increasing his knowledge of his kingdom, his domain. This was the land that would have to keep him alive, and it was no good relying on the names of those who had now passed away. He had broken into the middle school and found a large roll of tall white paper in the art room. He cut off a piece 4 feet by 4 feet and rolled it neatly and then placed it in a black plastic tube that was leaning against the wall. This would be his new map. He would be the cartographer of the new world that came after the abandonment. He didn't know what he would name these places, pathways. He didn't know what he would name these places, pathways and roads, but in a bone-deep way he knew that he would gain power over them by naming them. By naming the world, he would be claiming it as his own. There were other kinds of symbols on the map. Some indicated food stores, some tools and raw materials. Some of these were stores, and some were homes that were perfectly empty. The homes held some of the best items, things he would never find elsewhere. He visited a few of these each day, often having to break into them. It went like this. First, he would check the doors to see if they were locked, because everyone was worried about contagion and plague, most were. Then he took out a 5-pound sledgehammer from one of the saddlebags and slammed it down on the door handle. He didn't want to break any windows because even though he was breaking in, he held respect for these places. He didn't want to leave any entry holes for animals. Besides, he wasn't a thief. He was the sole survivor. These were his houses now. When the door handle eventually gave way, as long as there was no deadbolt, he gained entrance. Then he did a walk-through of the house looking for bodies. If he found any, he quickly went through closets, drawers, and cupboards, and if he found anything remarkable, he took it. Otherwise, he duct-taped the hole in the door where the handle used to be, pushed a heavy piece of furniture against the door, and smeared red paint in the window next to the door on the inside so that he would never come back into this place. And then he would exit by the side or the back door. Once outside, he would mark it with a black X on his map and move on. If he found no bodies, he took his time searching. He didn't like seeing everyone's personal items, especially the pictures. Sometimes he found himself inside of the homes of people he knew, kids at school, teachers, the people who worked at the stores he used to visit. Sometimes he even found himself tearful when catching a sidelong glance at a picture of a face. And often he had to turn on his MP3 player to its loudest setting because the whisperers seemed to be much louder inside the houses, and it felt like they were screaming at him. He carried a small pad and many pens and carefully noted things in the houses that might be of use to him someday. If the house was a good find, he closed it the same way but shot it with green paintballs and noted it with a green dot on his map. There was no way he could carry off all the canned foods, tools, clothing, and supplies that he might need later, but if he knew where to get them, he was one step ahead of death. Brady stopped to top off Rocinante's gas tank, which he did a couple of times a day. Max was thirsty, so Brady took out a small plastic bowl and opened a bottle of Poland Spring water, draining it. As Max drank, Brady opened another bottle and began to drink too. Water was a problem. The faucets didn't work anymore, and the water was probably undrinkable now that the sewage processing plants were no longer functioning. The great river that ran between the two cities had long been undrinkable, even before the abandonment, so it didn't seem like a viable option for water use now. He had some filtering equipment, but he was lucky one afternoon when he discovered a water bottling company down by the river whose natural spring was still flowing. It was about a half a mile outside of town, but worth the drive a few times a week to replenish his supply. It occurred to him that someday all the packages of food and bottles of water would run out. He would have to hunt and gather. With Max finished, Brady looked up into the sky and saw Huygens circling above them, waiting for him to start Rocinante and follow. Max and Huygens kept the loneliness at bay, and he found himself talking to them, asking them questions, and imagining their answers. Brady called, "Okay, old man, old Viking, I'm coming," as he turned the key, and the Polaris chugged to life. The bird was leading them to the Joshua Chamberlain Bridge and into Bangor. The road to the medical center had been closed to the general public sometime during the last days of civilization. There were cement barricades on Hancock Street and State Street with yellow and black-striped warnings stating, "Do not cross, medical emergency." He easily drove Rocinante over the lawn of a nearby house, bypassing the barricades altogether. In a moment, he was sitting on his four-wheeler staring at the Eastern Maine Medical Center. How had he avoided it for so long? It was the largest building complex in the area and would most certainly have been the center of activity during the abandonment. Perhaps he knew instinctively that this would be more than a tomb. So many must have perished here that it would have been transformed into a doorway to the underworld. This great protector of the people must have fought valiantly, a citadel dark and strong, standing alone against the onslaught of a virus that even it, with all of its resources, could not contain. This place of life must most certainly have become a place of death in a dying world. Brady couldn't bring himself to go any nearer than this, on the roadway, far enough from the entrance and what lay within. It was the very mouth of hell. But my mother worked here. Maybe she's alive. Brady went into observation mode. He became a recorder of images again, a detailer of things, and all of his feelings were temporarily turned off. He saw the green National Guard trucks and a great number of ambulances in the parking lot, and the Life Flight helicopter on the top of the parking garage. The large glass windows mirrored the blue sky and the clouds and all that was left. Hugin was perched on the power line just above him now, and from time to time croaked down at him. Brady took out his map and pencils and began to sketch. Instead of the gray-black tower, a great castle with a giant skull and crossbones over it. He drew slowly and deliberately, and then he wrote, "Entrance to Hades, beware," next to a dark doorway that became the entrance in his mind. Hugin croaked approvingly, and when Brady was done, he began to carefully roll the map into the tubular case he had duct-taped to Rocinante's fender. About a mile down the road from the Eastern Maine Medical Center, the turn to the area of the Bangor Mall and the Hogan Road forked. One way led to what used to be the busiest area of the two cities. The other led to a small town known as Veezy. This place his mother used to call the town of the living dead. It'd been a joke at the time, but now it made the small candles in his mind jump and flicker from the wind of imagination. He decided to take the long way to the mall, through Veezy, on the off chance that there might be someone, anyone, alive there. Driving on, he saw the entrance to the cemetery on his left, Mount Hope Cemetery. Brady had visited it with his mother a few times, not because they had any relatives there, but because it was a vast repository of local history, a showcase of white marble forest, of graves and tombs that would rival anything made later in the history of cemeteries. Mount Hope had been built on the model of the Mount Auburn Cemetery in New York during the heyday of American free enterprise and before the First World War. It was a model of fine and high living, even though it was built for the dead. Within the iron fencing and beyond the war memorials were the graves of the wealthy lumber barons of the 1840s and 50s. In this place lay the honored and humbled together, under high elm trees, near babbling rivulets and high green hills. It was a city of the dead, with fine tombs made of imported Italian marble and pink granite from the coast of Maine, paving many of the paths. There were all manner of tombstones, most somber and covered with simple, elegant epitaphs and moss, but some strange and remarkable and macabre ways. Brady recalled his mother, who loved history and read biographies, as she led him on a tour from gravestone to gravestone, saying, "See this one, Brady? There's a lock of hair from the dearly departed behind this piece of glass, sealed forever from the weather. And this one over here, it has an early photo, a daguerreotype of the person who lies below. Oh, and this one, it's made of zinc, a metal that will last forever, never fading, always new in the passing of long years. Oh, Brady," she would say, "just imagine the stories below our feet, all lost and forgotten. What would these people tell us if only they could talk?" Brady answers, "I know what they'd say. Get me the heck out of here. I want to be alive." His mother asked him, "Are you afraid of the cemetery, Brady?" He answered, "No, not afraid, just sad." His mother smiled, cradling his young head in the cup of her hands, brought him close and kissed him gently on the forehead. "Me too. I don't think anyone really understands death." And then he asked her, "Mom, do you believe in heaven?" A small look of concern, a nodding of the brow, and she answered, "Of course I do, honey. I hope you do too. 'Cause Dad is there, and he knows about us. He watches you growing up. He's proud of you, Brady. Yep, there's a heaven, all right." "Does God love everyone?" he asked. "Everyone, saints and sinners alike." He pondered for a moment and then asked quietly, "If there's a heaven, then is there a hell?" And she hesitated. "I don't know, honey. But I was taught there was. I'm just not so sure that this world might be hell enough for anyone." She paused, understanding in her way that she was confusing her child, and then she ought to make this very easy for him to understand. But she couldn't. Her own uncertainty stopped her. And then Brady asked, "If there's a hell, and God loves everyone, then how can anyone be in it? I mean, if heaven is full of love, then how can people there be happy when they know that some of their family and friends are suffering in hell?" She gave no answer. Sometimes silence was her answer. As he drove past the rows of stone, he thought that silence was the only answer left now. The best he could do was to live where all these others had perished. He would have a story worth telling, and there were these other stories that had been silenced, and he was determined to make sure his story was told. The best he could do was try to make a heaven out of what must be his own personal hell. As he drove through the city, now merely an enormous graveyard, each house a tombstone, he wondered to whom his story might be one day told. He took out his map and penciled in a rough drawing of the wrought iron gate, followed by several squares of gravestones, like trees in a forest on the whiteness of the paper. He labeled the place, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here, city of the dead." The entrance to the cemetery was through a great wrought iron gate, one of only 3 openings in the fence that surrounded it. He brought Rocinante to a stop and dismounted the machine, whistling for Max to follow him. Hugin was sitting nonchalantly on a tombstone next to the side of the road. To his left was the World War II memorial, a large angel rising heavenward, holding in his arms the limp body of a dead soldier. Brady gazed up at the angel for a long time before moving along. He had a hard time taking his gaze from the soldier. He wondered aloud to no one in particular. No more memorials for anyone, huh, Max? No one's going to build any more of these things. No one to remember them but us. From the corner of his eye, he saw a twitch, a slight movement that was impossible. Had the angel looked up from its perpetual gaze and met his eyes? No, it couldn't have been. Like something seen from the corner of his eye, he checked again to see that the angel, as it had been since some artisan mounted it there so many years ago, was still. He could have sworn it moved. He took his map out and began taking the lay of the land. Over the hill was Vizy, a sleepy little town even before the abandonment, where they rolled up the sidewalks precisely at 5 o'clock every night. To the left and over another rise beyond the mausoleum was the area of the Bangor Mall and all the development that no one would ever need again. If he put this road on his map, it would cut a long way off the trek from this part of town to the mall area. He could avoid the river altogether and just cut straight through the cemetery. As he laid the map on the ground near the back of Rocinante, he heard a sound again. It was a whisper. The soft and nearly silent sigh of a sound such as a child might make in its sleep, different from the whispers that he had been hearing in his head, the ghosts of his imagination. There, he heard it again, distinctly. In observation mode again, he turned to the left and scanned the area, scrutinizing every inch of his vision. A movement danced in the distance, a strange and disturbing motion that should not have been there. "The world has changed," he whispered aloud. There were many things now that should not be, and many things that should be that were not. No power in the universe could draw his vision from what he saw now in the distance among a number of undersized headstones, all grouped together, the final resting place of the Bangor Children's Home circa 1910. At least 100 small white slabs were placed far more closely together than any other stones he could see. Orphans. Dead orphans. Although he had more reason than anyone to believe in ghosts, he was transfixed by the scene in front of him. His heart was beating a frenzied staccato, and he struggled to catch short, faint breaths. This was fear, stone-cold, paralyzing fear, and he was a stone statue, unmoving, planted to the ground. Among the stones were the first human forms he had seen in weeks. People. No, these were not people, as he knew them. These were shades, phantoms, ghosts. They were the forms of children wandering, weaving their way among their own headstones. The orphans, the children left behind, the children left all alone, incorporeal and faint, like something seen through a fog. Any other boy on any other day might have run from that place. Any other boy might have doubted his vision, but not Brady. The city was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. So this place was something more. something older. The graveyard was no longer a storage place for the beloved dead. The city, now devoid of people, was simply a mass of buildings and streets that reflected nothing but the darkness and the full-spectrum echo of a world that used to be. People made a city. Quiet made a graveyard. This graveyard was now the city. The city was now the graveyard. As Brady watched, he saw them appearing all around him, white and faded like the old and chipping paint against the south side of a house. They faded into his vision, half there and in a minor key. They were memories of shadows, not shades, more missing than apparent, but he saw them, first a few and then more, until the whole place seemed like it was a city of ghosts. An invisible realm suddenly made visible now that so few were left to witness their presence. Fear began to fade within him, and he lost the urge to scream. How strange, he thought, to miss the company of others so much, only to be surrounded by the ghosts of others, none of which could hear him, see him, or acknowledge his presence. The dearly departed were walking among the graves as though they were merely strolling through a park. Dressed in their finest funeral clothes, they smiled and greeted each other politely, these neighbors beneath the soil, these dwellers in the darkness. They didn't appear as Brady thought the dead should, with fraying flesh and decay enveloping them like a shroud. Instead, they were arrayed in their finest apparel. Although they were spectral in nature, he knew a happy smile when he saw one. There was a lovely elderly woman who reminded him of his downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Eldridge. Her long gown, gray and colorless, bespoke of a grandeur Brady had seen only in black and white films. She had a regal bearing and walked gracefully, waving with a mere flick of her wrist. She could never frighten anyone. She was beautiful. He saw a young man, perhaps 25, dressed in a woolen jacket and vest and shoes and spats, waving to an elderly man across the way. The elderly man's ashen visage shone with a bright smile, and he picked up his ancient pace until he was running right through the gravestones in his eagerness. They met in the middle of the road and embraced. Brady could discern the ethereal tears washing down both of their cheeks, and he thought, these might be two long-lost brothers, or a father and a son, joyfully reunited, awake from the slumber of the long sleep of death. He couldn't hear them, though he saw them clearly. Were these the ghosts he heard in the darkness in his bed just before falling asleep, the whisperers? Where were their voices? He strained to hear them, to be an eavesdropper on their conversations. What were they talking about? Every fiber of his being yearned for the knowledge of which they spoke. Was he smiling? Was his solitary existence lifted only for a while as he stood there in the midst of the resurrected dead? He thought, I'm the ghost in this world. They can't see me, but they can see each other. This is truly what it means to be a ghost. He was aware of the greater humanity surrounding him, and he could take it no longer. He wanted to talk to them, but what would he talk about? What did he have in common with them? They continued to greet each other and speak together, smiling and laughing and crying. Unable to bear it any longer, he turned his eyes away as they surrounded him, and he had no choice but to walk among and through them to reach Rocinante. He had parked near the plot of the Bangor orphanage, and he was unable to avoid seeing the children running and jumping, rolling on the ground and laughing. Most of them were very young, and one of them had a small rubber ball that he was trying to throw to another child. It wasn't a real ball that he was throwing, but the memory of a ball, a spectral one. How did he get such a thing, this ghost child? Brady decided that he must have been buried with it, and that somewhere underneath his feet in the grave of this small boy there was a small rubber ball being clutched lovingly. Someone must have known that he loved it so much that they saw to it that he took it with him to paradise. That thought made a tear well up in Brady's eye for the first time since he woke up from his fever and delirium a few weeks ago. He'd cried for Noah, but that was a moment of anger. He had not even cried in sorrow for any of the people whose bodies he'd been encountering these past weeks. Not really. But now he was crying. What was it about the thought of the orphan boy and his beloved toy, a person dead for over 100 years, that stirred his heart when the death of the world hadn't moved him? The little boy missed the ball, and it landed soundless on the ground and rolled toward Brady, stopping at his feet. Brady froze to the spot, not moving, not frightened, but hoping to avoid any contact with this child. The form of the boy ran over to the ball, bent over, and plucked it from the ground next to Brady's feet. The boy was kneeling on one knee, and as he looked up, he did something that none of the other spirits did. He made eye contact with Brady. Brady stared back into the little boy's eyes and smiled. The child's surprised and wide-eyed face smiled back and spoke to Brady, and though Brady couldn't hear him, he could read his lips. The little boy asked, "Are you a ghost?" For a long moment, Brady stayed silent and still, a chill of realization freezing him to the spot. How could he answer this question? Was he a ghost? To the spirits now evident to him walking and talking in their community, he was the ethereal one. To the children who all saw each other running, laughing, and playing, he was the one on the other side who couldn't interact with them, locked in a prison that only one of them could see. Brady shook his head from side to side and smiled and said slowly, so the boy might read his lips, "No, I'm a friend." The boy nodded affirmatively, smiled, and grasped the ball tightly in his hand as he rose and ran off toward the graves and his friends. Brady watched him go, and began to understand why he was moved by the thought of an orphan child, unclaimed and long gone. He was now the orphan. He wasn't a ghost, but he was living in a ghost world. He sat on Rocinante for a long time, longingly watching the people, especially the children, taking them in. If this had happened a few weeks before the abandonment, when things ran according to science and logic, he would have thought he was crazy. There were no such things as ghosts in that world. In this world, a world that he now ruled, named, and reinvented, ghosts were now as real as a sunrise. He watched for at least an hour, and the sun approached its zenith, indicating noon. He looked at his watch, and as the sun reached its high point, the figures in the cemetery disappeared. He was alone again. He wearily started Rocinante and scouted for Hugin in the air, but he was gone. He came and went at will, as wanderers do. Brady was exhausted from his vision and only wanted to go home and rest. As quietly as he could, he rolled out of the graveyard back towards Brewer. The sun was a bright, flaming chariot beginning its long fall from the sky, and the wind was beginning to blow more fiercely. It whipped the trees into conversation as the silver and brown trunks and branches swayed like dancers in the breeze. It roared past his ears as he drove, and it cooled his skin like ice. He drove past the old Bangor waterworks and down past the railroad tracks, and then took State Street, which he had renamed the High Road, up to the hospital, the entrance to Hades. Feeling more tired than frightened, he stopped the four-wheeler on the road next to the emergency room entrance and took the edifice in from this angle. There were some liquid oxygen tanks that were spilling their contents in a white hissing cloud of ancient cold. He knew that this was a safety mechanism, and that eventually they would stop when the pressure equalized. He also knew how dangerous these were. One spark would be all that was needed to ignite a tremendous explosion. This was yet another reason to avoid this place. There were a number of Green Army vehicles parked haphazardly around the area, along with ambulances, trucks, and Hummers. He could only imagine the number of military vehicles still left inside, and he had a tremendous imagination. Thoughts of his mother again arose in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder if she had made it. His love for her was so strong that if she'd died, he thought, somehow he would feel it. He would know it in a bone-deep and heart-clenching way. Since he didn't feel this way, he hoped beyond hope that she had survived somehow. He'd made it. Maybe she did too. Did he survive because he was sick at the time and somehow the sickness made him immune to the effects of the disease? Maybe it was a genetic thing. Maybe he had survived because he was born with a resistance to it. Maybe his mother also had this resistance. All of this went through his mind like a dust devil in a wheat field, disturbing his already troubled thoughts. He felt the burning grow in his chest, slight warmth, and then a hot flash. What was that? He put his hand into his shirt and felt his grandfather's metal glowing with heat, like a signal or a beacon against danger. Why would it glow hot, he wondered. Is it like Harry Potter's scar? Is it like Bilbo's sword sting? Does it get hot when I'm near danger? And that was when he heard the scream. Even though the wind filled his ears with its own muffling roar, he was certain that he'd heard a piercing, blood-curdling scream. It came from the entrance to Hades, and it seemed both frightened and a plea for help. His blood was ice. His mind was stone. He sat there on Rocinante and waited for another sound to confirm his wild imaginings, and he didn't know but the sun was low in the western sky when he shook his head and started the four-wheeler and left. I must be going insane. First the whisperers, and now a screamer. What am I going to do? From the heights of the edifice, a foul and putrid-smelling creature gazed down upon the lonely figure making its pathetic way back to its home. He hunkered down like the detestable creature he was, and threw his head into the air, tasting the scent of the boy like a carrion beast might savor the stench of death itself. Long he sat there on his haunches, contemplating and considering his next move. How long would he have to wait for this boy to come to him? Why had he not investigated her scream? Perhaps he was deaf. Perhaps he was afraid. No, the monster knew better than that. Fear alone would not keep the boy away, and loneliness should purge his fear, make him less careful and more curious. Perhaps his error was eliciting only one scream. Perhaps the boy was as intelligent and wily as he suspected, and he doubted his own senses rather than enter this place. His hardened heart asked him if he might venture into the night and overcome the boy on his own, outside of the safety of his sorcery. His answer to his heart was no, not yet. His own fear of the new world that might rise up and destroy him, consume him the moment he stepped foot out of his only sanctuary, stopped him. He didn't know this world yet. It called to him, and yet he was afraid. If it came to that, he might have to venture forth into the abandonment, but before he would step out onto the streets where the ghosts had risen and the whisperers kept their counsel, he would use all of his powers to destroy this boy, before the boy destroyed him. The boy was his nemesis, the girl was his bait. As the moon rose, he stood on his hind legs and threw his head into the air, and then he howled, long and loud. It was the call of the wild, the summoning song that beckoned the changed ones. These marauders would do his bidding. They were like him, made anew from something old. They had no choice but to answer his call, for this was a relationship fashioned in the deep eons of time, long before people and worlds. In his howl, though it might sound to anyone like a wolf's long lament to the endless night of the universe, he spoke these words. My brothers, seek the boy and his creature. Kill them. End their existence, so that I may come into my own. Gather yourselves and take counsel, I bid you. End his days. In the far distance of the woods and empty world, the were-dogs began to howl, one by one. End of chapter.